So now we're going to prepare the handles for attaching to the bag. As you can see here, I accidentally didn't line up the trim that I added to the edges of my handles, and I'm going to leave it like that. So we're going to be stitching a box onto each handle that as we stitch it onto the bag. So you can either just stitch around the stitching that you've already done and across the middle here, or you can add an X into that as well, depending on how much you'd like to reinforce your handle. So I'm just going to mark a line an inch up from each side here so that I can have a straight edge to stitch across on. And just flip that round and do that on each of the other sides as well. Okay, so that's going to be my stitching guide for sewing that onto the bag. So we can just set that aside. Now we're going to mark the placement for where we're going to attach the handles. So the pattern says to mark this at 2 3/4 inches. Helps if I get my rule around the right way. 2 3/4 inches in from the center seam and 2 inches down. So line up the 2 3/4 line here and 2 inches down. I'm going to place a mark here, and I'm also going to mark an inch out from here. I'm going to repeat that. So 2 3/4 is here. I'm going to do an inch out from that and an inch here. So these are going to be the guides for lining up the handles. So just grab yourself a handle here, and I'm going to line those 2 marked lines up that I've done here, and just pop a clip on each side here to help hold that in place. Now you can't pin this thoroughly, so this is just going to be the best that you can do, and just clip one of these at a time if you like, if you find it's pulling, but the guide that you've drawn here should help you line this up to stitch nice and straight. Okay, so that's ready to take to the machine. So the back handle here says to measure 3 3/4 inches across from each side edge and 2 inches down. So I'm going to mark an inch up from here and an inch across here, making sure I'm keeping this all straight. And then repeating that here. So 2 inches down, 3 3/4 inches across. Okay, so now I'm going to align that second handle up with the mark that I've got here. So just whack a clip in place, just holding that where you want it to go. Move that down a little bit more, and this one as well. And Then if you like, just double check that you have got your measurements right here before you dive in and sew it. Now you might have noticed that I've left my threads long on my bag here, and the purpose of this is so that I can pull these to the back. So just tug on that bobbin thread until you see that top thread start to pull through. Then you can just hook your seam ripper in that and pull that through to the back. Now if you're lucky, you might be able to also get the thread where you started from to poke through as well, and that's really just going to depend on whether you've stitched over it or not. If you can't, don't worry about it, because that's a good indication that you're not going to have that coming undone anyway. Now if you haven't already done so, you can go ahead and mark the midpoint along this top edge so that we can align our casing to this. And you can do this by just folding this in half, or you can measure it if you prefer. So just double check that I have measured that properly. Yep. Okay, so we're going to push this handle down out of the way, and I'm going to take the longer of the two casings, and as you can see, I've marked my midpoint on this casing. So you can do that just by folding that in half and pinching that as well. So we're going to place that so that this is right sides together, and align these raw edges and clip those layers together. Okay, so then we'll move on to the front section. So the front section has a nice center seam for us, so we don't need a midpoint marked on this. So just push that handle down out of the way and take your front casing and align that midpoint with the center seam there, and then just clip these together. So now we're going to take both of these pieces to the sewing machine, and we're going to stitch along these raw edges at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, making sure to back stitch at the beginning and end really well. So now we're ready to sew this bag together, and then all that will be left to do is sew the lining together and put that in. So you're going to place the front of your bag on top of the back of the bag, right sides together, and you're going to align the right hand side. So grab yourself plenty of clips for this together. Then I like to move down to the bottom of the bag and clip that together, then stretch it out, just checking that you've got it evenly spaced there, and then just whack a couple more clips in Okay, so that side's all done. Now as you can see, the front of the bag is not going to sit flat once we start clipping all of this together. So you're going to have to manipulate this a little bit just to hold it into place. So then clip the middle and then just pop another couple of clips on like so. Now this is where I like to take it to the machine, and I will sew this right hand side and this bottom edge, and then I'll come back and I will clip and sew this last edge. And I just find it a little bit easier just to have to handle one side and the bottom before I have to manipulate this last side into place. Okay, so now we've got the sides and the bottom of the bag assembled, and I've pressed my sides just by reaching my iron in there and giving that a press. So now we're going to box the corners here. So you need to pick up your bag with your bottom seam on the top, and we're going to bring these two open edges here together, and I'm going to nest these seams by having the bottom seam going towards the left and the side seam going towards the right here. So just open that out and check that you're going to have those two meeting. And place a clip on that. And then I'm going to pull on my bag, might need to reach your hand in there, right out down on these side edges. So we're not so concerned right now with right up the top where the seam is, but opening this right out, right further down lower on the bag, and giving that a really good tug, and that's going to really help these edges meet up really well. So if you want, you can actually put a clip lower down here just to keep this nice and spread out, and then put some clips along these raw edges to hold that in place. So now we're ready to take these corners to the sewing machine and stitch along here at 1/4 inch seam allowance. So here we have the bag all assembled, and I'm just going to turn it right side out and just have a quick look at it. Just check that I'm happy with how my seams are looking. So just push out those corners. That seam's meeting very nicely. And that seam's meeting very nicely as well. So I'm pretty happy with that. So here we've got the front lining and the back lining with the bottom corners cut out of it as the pattern states. So we're just going to place this right sides together and line up the first seam here. And this is going to be the seam that I'm going to leave my opening in for turning my bag through. So I'm going to leave, well, the length of my ruler between a 5 inch and a 6.5 inch hole here is probably good. So just grab your clips and hold that together. And we're going to pull this over and align this at the bottom here. So if you find this a little bit tricky to keep all this lining up together neatly, feel free to just stitch one seam at a time. Now I'm just going to take this to the sewing machine and sew each of these seams at 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I'm going to leave an opening here between the two marks that I've marked here so that we can turn the bag through when we're finished. So I've got my lining sewn together here, and I've pressed my seams open here, and a handy little trick here that you can do when you've got an opening to sew up later is to press this seam open at 1/4 inch seam allowance as well, and that just gives you a nice edge to hand sew together. Or already, if you're going to just machine stitch it, you've already got those edges pressed so that you can quickly stitch them up. Okay, so we're just going to box the corners the way we did on the outside of the bag. So just match those seams from the side and from the bottom up together really accurately as you can. Put a clip on this, and then make sure you're pulling the lining out, stretching it out properly, and that will really help those edges line up nice and straight. Now we're just going to take this to the sewing machine and stitch each of these seams at 1/4 inch seam allowance. So here's my lining all sewed together, and the last thing that we need to do, if you haven't already done this, is just mark the midpoints on the top edge of your lining. So just match those side seams up together and give that a good pinch. And that a good pinch. And then you can mark both of those. So take your bag exterior and keep this right side out, and take your lining and keep this wrong side out. So we're going to place the exterior of the bag inside the lining, making sure that we're matching the fronts of the lining with, so that's this way, with the front of the bag. So you can squish this up and push this inside. Making sure all the casing and handles are all poking down, nothing's sticking out. And then we're going to align the side seams on the lining with the side seams on the bag. And flop around to the other side. So just opening that up and having a look so you can see that they're matching properly. Then we're going to line up the midpoint of our lining with the midpoint on the casing that we can see here, and flip around to do the other side. And you'll know that you've got everything facing the right way if everything is lining up and matching nicely. So then just work your way around, just spreading this lining out evenly and adding extra clips. So now I'm going to stitch around this top edge of the bag, and I'm going to be stitching from the inside so that I can see the original stitching that I've done on my casing here. So I'm just going to take it slow because this is quite bulky. You'll need to smush everything out of the way just to make sure that you're not catching anything that you shouldn't be catching. So just take it slowly and you'll find that you'll be fine. So now comes the really exciting part where we can turn this right side out through the hole that you've left in the lining. So just very gently pull your bag through. You don't want to rip anything bigger than it already is. So just take your time here, pushing everything out. And then you can push your lining back down inside your bag here. Just check that your casing on the front and the back, nothing's gotten caught. And that is looking really, really nice. I'm really, really excited about that. We are going to top stitch the lining and the exterior of the bag just underneath the casing here. So I'm going to take this and give this a really good press just to make sure that everything is nice and opened out. Any stray threads from the fabric, just make sure that they're not sticking out. And then after I've pressed this, I'm going to take this to the machine and just stitch about 1/8 of an inch away on the exterior of the bag, just to help hold the casing up and nice and smoothly. So I have taken off the tray table from my machine here, just so I have a little bit more space to get my bag under so that I can do this top stitching. I've also replaced my thread with the pink thread that I've done the other top stitching on the handles with. So bear this in mind. Also think about where you'd like your stitching to start and stop. And if you're clever with this, you can do this fairly invisibly. So if you've got a true free arm machine, then you won't have a problem getting this under. Otherwise you're going to have to just wiggle it under, take your time and just go slowly. So I'm feeling with my finger and pushing that lining underneath. Now as I'm coming up to where I've started, I'm going to be pulling my top thread through to the back and doing my best to stop stitching exactly where I started again. So in fact, I've got this a little bit crooked here, so I'm actually going to cut my threads then I'm going to stitch up a little bit higher here and then stop exactly where I've started. In fact, I might do one extra stitch just because that one looks a little bit loose. So pull your threads long and snip them off, and then you can pull that top thread through, so you've got all 4 threads behind there, and you have a nice invisible join here. And I'll show you how to bury these threads so that everything is nice and neat and hidden on this side as well. So now go ahead and sew up the opening on the side seam. So here I've got a special needle called a cheetah needle or an open-eyed needle, or an easy thread needle. There's quite a few different names for it, but essentially you can just slide the ends of the thread through the back of the needle rather than having to poke them through, and you can use extremely short threads for this. So the way to use this needle, I'm going to place this basically into the fabric right where one of the stitches is going in, and I'm going to poke it between the layers of the fabric, so make sure that it's not coming through on the front, and then you can poke it out, back out through the lining. I'm going to poke it almost all the way through, just enough, and then because one of my threads here is quite short, so you're just going to pick that up and you're going to slide that into the needle until you hear it pop, and then I'm going to get another thread and do the same again. So I just usually do 2 threads at a time because otherwise they don't all tend to go through. So then you're just going to pull on the shaft of the needle and they will nicely slide inside. That one didn't go all the way in. I'm just going to do that one again. So basically you're pulling your threads in back inside the lining. There we go. So you're just going to trim that level with the fabric. Now I'm going to repeat this with the remaining 2 threads. So just check that you're not going through to the front. So poke that almost all the way through. Then I'm going to slide both of those threads into the back of that needle until you can hear them pop, and then grab the shaft and give them a tug and just pull them all the way inside the lining. Then you can trim them off. And that's how you get a nice neat join on your threads on the back and on the front as well. Now I thought you might like some final instructions on how to press your bag. So if you find that your bag is quite scrunched up from being pulled through the lining and squished under the sewing machine, here's some tips on how I actually press my bags finally at the end. So I like to take an old towel and just place it inside just for a bit of extra support. And then you can just grab your iron and run it over there and just give it a good press and just get rid of any of those creases that appeared as you constructed the bag.